So I want to set the scene for what Jane Jensen and Michelle Venn will discuss by thinking about different conceptions of inequality and what these different conceptions of inequality might mean for public policy. And I'm going to argue in favor of adopting more expansive conceptions of inequality. So we all know that we live in an era of rising inequality. This figure draws on a famous book by Thomas Piketty, and the chart shows the share of national income going to people in the top 1/10 of 1% in Canada. And on the right-hand side, also the Gini index, a well-known measure of inequality. My parents, that's my father, were born in a moment of high inequality. I was born at a time when inequality was falling. I was born in Montreal. I was a very chubby baby. And many people here were born, as I look around, somewhat later, and of course, just at the time when inequality of various sorts has been rising quite dramatically. But these facts alone, this kind of chart, doesn't tell us as much as we want to know about well-being, or indeed about how to improve well-being. Do the sums that Galen Weston or Paul Desmarais earn every year really matter to us? I mean, I care more about whether Jane Jensen earns more money than I do every year, but even that causes me only a small bit of mental anguish. Much more important than relative income, I think, is absolute income, namely the incomes earned by people around the median, and you can see the arrow points to this part of the diagram. Median incomes in Canada have not varied very dramatically over the last 30 years. And so here the news is not especially good. Lower level incomes, which is a bar just above, have risen slightly more, and that's good news. But though poverty rates in Canada are falling, they remain alarmingly high, as I think we all know here, especially among Indigenous people. Moreover, the stagnation of median income, the stagnation of average income, is a reflection of deeper economic problems, problems that aren't going to be easy to solve. So we know, for instance, that wages are tied to productivity, but productivity in Canada is rising much less quickly than it is in the US to the south. And for the first time in decades, a gap has opened up between the rate of growth of productivity and the rate of growth of wages. I think this diagram is one of the most important that we can see today. It means that ordinary people are no longer securing the fruits of their labor in the way that they did for decades in this country and in the US. The gap is larger in the US, but it's apparent and present in Canada as well. Now, in order to understand the impact of income inequality on well-being, I think we also need to take an additional step. We need to realize that at the same time that incomes are becoming more unequal, an increasing number of basic goods on which people depend to maintain their style of life, a basic set of goods that were once provided more or less free or at low cost, often provided as public goods by government, an increasing number of those goods are now becoming commodities for which people are being charged, and the prices of those commodities are going up. So there's a kind of commoditization here that's important. College tuition is an example. This is Canadian college tuition. Since 1990, tuition in Canadian universities has tripled, partly because governments are funding a smaller share of the cost of tuition. So the burden borne by low-income families in particular has risen dramatically, and of course education is especially important because it's the means to rise on the social ladder. But the same thing is true of home energy. Energy used to heat and light the home has become increasingly expensive in Canada over the past 20 years. More than 1 million Canadians now spend more than 10% of their income on heating, energy, light alone. So the result, to use a kind of technical term of social science, is a double whammy. Just as incomes are becoming more unequal, access to basic goods is being increasingly rationed by income. And I think this is something all of us who study these phenomena need to think about. So what do these observations imply for people concerned about social justice, concerned about social well-being? I think we can draw three tentative conclusions here from this part of what I want to say. First, I think top incomes don't matter that much. What we should really be thinking about is the trajectory of average incomes, the incomes of ordinary people at the median and below the median. Second, I have to get this to work. Second, I think the solutions to inequality don't lie entirely in redistribution by governments. That's what we normally think about. But we should also be concerned about what Jacob Hacker calls pre-distribution. That is, how the institutions of the Canadian economy distribute market income before taxes and transfers. And to some extent, this turns on government regulations, regulations about minimum wages, regulations that require firms to provide decent pensions and benefits. But it also depends on whether firms act in the interests of their stakeholders as well as in the interest of their shareholders. And on and that depends to some extent on whether trade unions are strong enough to pressure them to do so. And on that front, the news isn't particularly good here. Finally, these observations direct our attention, I think, to the issue of what I'd call public provision, namely the extent to which governments are willing to deliver public goods and to deliver them at low cost. I'm thinking about sports facilities, libraries, internet access, public transport. I mean, consider London, England, for instance, where I usually am in the spring. A short ride on the London subway, the tube, costs $9 Canadian these days, in case any of you were thinking of going there this spring. But at the same time, public transit, buses and subway are free for all London residents over the age of 60. Think what a difference that makes, but think that that difference applies to some people and not to others. So public provision, in which Canada has always been more successful than the US, I might add, is another key feature of inequality and what we might be doing about it. Okay, so before closing, I want to take a second step, I've got only 15 minutes here, towards expanding our conception of inequality. And I want to move beyond income to think about other forms of inequality and how they impinge on well-being. So how might we do this? Well, one way to do this is to adopt what members of the CIFAR Successful Societies program have begun to call a capabilities approach to well-being. And this is elaborated in our first book. I can only touch on it briefly here, but I want to say something about it. The basic idea is that all people face a common set of life challenges, finding housing, finding a spouse, caring for children, finding a job, and the like. And to these life challenges, every person brings a certain set of capabilities. So each person's well-being depends to some extent on the balance between the life challenges that person faces and the capabilities the person brings to those life challenges. So the question of interest for us, of course, is where do those capabilities come from? And of course, we know that some of them reside in qualities of character that are nurtured during childhood, and this means that the circumstances for early childhood development are very important in this context. But a person's capabilities are also conditioned by her position within a broader set of social and economic structures, a broader set of social and economic relations. And by virtue of this, her position in this set of economic relations, a person can call upon certain economic resources for her capabilities. And of course, the classic example is income. Income's a multi-purpose instrument that can be used, as we all know, to cope with a variety of life challenges. But workplace autonomy also matters here. The security of employment also matters here. Whether you can leave your job to take care of a sick child makes a big difference to your well-being. And in much the same way, the members of this program suggest that every person occupies certain positions within a parallel set of social structures that provide that person with certain social resources. So these structures include social networks, namely ties to friends and family who might help with finding a job, might help with finding housing or caring for a child, might provide emotional support in the context of sickness. And these structures, these social structures, also specify the social status that a person enjoys. And status is important because people often call upon their status in order to secure the cooperation of others in life endeavors. That's why I'm wearing a tie today, in order to emphasize my social status, so you'll accept the answers I give to anybody's questions. And status is dependent to some extent on the collective imaginary of the community. I can't say much about this at the moment, but the broad set of narratives that tell us who belongs to the community and what the members of the community owe one another. So the basic idea should be pretty clear here, although it isn't very clear in my slide. A person's well-being does not simply depend on her place within the distribution of income. It also depends on her place within a distribution of social resources, not just economic resources, but social resources. And this is important because research I've done for the Successful Societies program shows that social resources are also distributed unequally across societies. This slide shows you people divided by a standard set of social classes, and it gives you measures for the different kinds of social ties, in this case social networks. How dense are the social networks that each person experiences? There's a kind of conventional wisdom which says that, well, the wealthy can use money to solve their problems, the poor don't have money, but they use social networks to solve their problems. But what this kind of figure suggests to you is that, in fact, it's the wealthy who have better, denser, larger social networks, and those at lower levels of income lack not only income, but they lack the social ties that are a critical social resource. Let me close again by asking, what are the implications of this somewhat broader capabilities perspective on well-being? What are the implications for people concerned about social justice and social well-being as a whole? Well, first, we should all be concerned not only about the distribution of material resources, but about the distribution of social resources, namely about the access that different kinds of people have to social networks and the various kinds of status conferred on different kinds of people by the collective imaginaries of our society, the collective imaginary of Quebec or of Canada. And the Successful Societies program has shown that these resources impinge not only on people's general well-being, but also on their health. And if you want, later on, I can show you some figures about that. Secondly, I think this observation implies that the efforts of civic organizations, which many of you here represent, to build social networks among the less affluent and to improve the social status assigned to marginalized communities like Indigenous peoples. Those efforts to build social networks and to alter the status hierarchy may be as important to overall well-being and the well-being of the people you're serving as efforts to increase the material resources to those communities. This is not a substitute for material resources, but it's something we shouldn't forget. And finally, these observations have some important implications for public policy. Governments, as we all know, are often fixated on the distribution of material resources. But public policies can also enhance or erode the distribution of social resources. And governments often do that as a byproduct, an inadvertent byproduct of policies aimed in other directions. So if changes in a particular set of zoning laws in one part of Montreal may have some benefits, maybe in some ways it contributes to the gentrification of a community, and maybe that has economic benefits. If those changes in zoning laws eliminate fast food restaurants in that area, some may see that as desirable, but that could well be, as I well know from my own community, that could well eliminate the gathering points at which the elderly in that community get together every morning and forge their own social networks. So well-meaning policies described mainly in terms of their material effects often have unintended consequences with regard to the distribution of social resources. Labor regulations designed to improve job mobility may well in some ways help people secure jobs, but at the same time they may also isolate people, take them away from their ties to families and friends that can be a very important part of their social well-being. In other words, we need to think about public policy making in a somewhat new way as a process of social resource creation. We need to recognize that public policies can enhance and they can erode, they can alter the distribution of social resources. And policymakers should be attentive, I think, to this side, and as citizens we should all be attentive to this side of public policy making. We all worry about the conservation of natural resources. We should also be worried about the conservation of social resources, and I think that poses an agenda of some importance for many governments, including governments in Quebec. Thank you.